This video is sponsored by Magic Spoon. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but Games Workshop ruined my life. Over the last year and some change, I have committed myself to building and painting a full 2,000 point Dark Eldar army, a Drukhari army. And as of last weekend, I put the finishing touches on the last 2,000 points. I did it. I built an entire army, and so now it's time for the cherry on top. And what is the cherry on top of a Warhammer 40,000 army? Well, it is dipping into Forge World. Now, when Warhammer fans hear the name Forge World, their ears perk up a little bit in excitement, but they also wince because they know what Forge World means. And that means an incredibly expensive, but often breathtakingly beautiful resin kit that is often the last miniature that you would ever buy for a Warhammer collection. Pretty much every faction has their kit. I have examples in the Forge World 2014 catalog. My copy is horribly water damaged from when my house flooded, but I still got the pictures. Looking through the pages of this crinkly mess is like taking a trip down memory lane. It's exciting to see these Forge World things in person. I've only got to see a few, but they are the Bigfoots of the Warhammer army world. For Chaos, they have the Great Brass Scorpion. I've always loved this thing. Necrons get a whole suite, at least they used to, with the Canoptek Tombstalkers and the Funky Flyers. The Eldars have their Phantom Titans. These things are enormous, Dire Avenger for scale. Orcs get the Gargantuan Squiggoth. The Tau get the biggest miniature ever made in the Manta. Space Marines have the Thunderhawk gunship, and the Darkin, the evil Eldar, get, in my opinion, the best looking mini Forge World has ever made, the 2011 Tantalus. I love the Tantalus, and I always knew the end of my Dark Eldar journey would include the Tantalus. In fact, I have two. But last week, in 10th edition Warhammer, the newest balanced data slate, the Tantalus is no longer in the game. Apparently 10 years is too long to wait on the Tantaluses, and by the time I'm gonna get to play with these guys in game, they're not gonna get to play in the game. They don't have rules anymore. And I don't get why all of the other factions get to have their big awesome thing, but the Drukhari, who are still missing some of our regular old kits from 40K, we don't get to play with the Tantalus either. I'm pretty heartbroken by this decision from Games Workshop to axe the Tantalus, but I've still got some Tantalus, Tantaluses, Tantali, and I'm gonna put them together. I'm gonna paint them, I'm gonna bring them in games. Maybe not in competitive RTTs or tournaments, but they're gonna see tabletop time. I've been waiting for this moment for the better part of a year, and even if Games Workshop's gonna try to take it away from me, they're not gonna win. These two breathtaking boats are both previously loved. The previous owners got them started, and I'm gonna be the one to finish them. This kit is bizarre. It has huge, elegant resin panels that make up the hull, etched brass, which Games Workshop hasn't sold etched brass in years. It's very experimental of Games Workshop. As the razor-sharp decking of these space yachts, it's perfect. Well, it looks perfect. One thing resin is bad at is being long and thin, and a lot of these parts are warped. And looking through the rest of the parts, there are microscopic little teeth and a beautiful piece of etched brass. This kit is a piece of Warhammer history from a more experimental age. My Tantaluses have seen some winners, so the first step is gonna get these guys tidied up with a little bath. I prepared a bath of 50/50 LA's Totally Awesome and water and got to work scrubbing down these boats. I don't know if the previous owners gave these resin parts a bath yet. Games Workshop resin needs to be washed to get rid of the mold release agent that'll stop the paint from sticking properly. And it's also a good idea just to help knock off the 10 years of dust that's collected on these battle boats. One unique challenge of the Eldar is their vehicles must be perfect. Chaos, Orcs, and the Imperium get away with surface imperfections, but I want my Eldar constructs to be clean. I took some 220 grit sandpaper and gave everything a sand. Doing this in the bath will keep the dust down. The painted Tantalus was a bit more problematic. Some of the paint was rock solid, but some of it flaked right off. I just sanded every inch and what stayed. Now I can finish assembling. The command bridge has lovely little railing holes that all need to be carefully fixed, as they didn't come out of the mold great. I glued the two halves together and sanded every bit of railing to get them as flat and smooth as they should actually be. And speaking of smooth and flat, these parts are warped, probably a little from the manufacturing and then sitting in a plastic baggie for the last 10 years. I dunked them in a bath of hot water for a minute. This made the parts really soft, and while they were soft, I bent them back into the proper shape and held them there while they cooled off. This sorta fixes them, but I wouldn't leave these suckers in a hot car. But you know what can easily handle a hot car? That's right, today's sponsor. You ever have those late nights turn into late nights and you're feeling hungry while painting a miniature, but you don't want the hassle of preparing food? Remember when you were younger on Saturday mornings eating a big bowl of cereal? Well, Magic Spoon is that cereal grown up for you. With all the same delicious flavors you remember, we've been trying it out for ourselves and think it's great. We also love these little protein treats. They're great in the morning if you don't have time to sit down, or as a great little pick-me-up right before heading out to the store for a game of 40K. All the same great flavors in a bite-sized package. Magic Spoon is made for all kinds of diets, including keto, celiac, diabetic, and high-protein, low-sugar lifestyles. The cereal has 12 to 14 grams of protein per serving and no sugar, which makes it perfect for people who want a little protein boost on the go. You can buy the flavors you love on their site, and if you're not satisfied, they offer a 100% happiness guarantee. If you're not satisfied with your cereal, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Use my code EONS or click the link in the description below to try Magic Spoon cereal or treats today and get $5 off. You can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or at your local grocery store. On the front of these boats, they had a little wing that arches over the two sides of the ship's hull. I think this is meant to be a seamless transition, but out of the box, it definitely is not seamless. I dremeled the resin into shape and then used lots of Tamiya putty and sanding to make this seam disappear. And on just about every single spike and blade, all these bites taken out had to be fixed. I used a combination of sanding twigs and a round file to get these spots back to perfect. On the larger, less perfect connections, like the command deck onto the hull, I used 2-part epoxy to get these together. This stuff is incredibly strong and importantly, thick, and it'll fill in the gaps of these imperfect connections. JB Quick Weld sets in 6 minutes, so I can move right along to more sanding and perfecting. Lots and lots of sanding. The trouble with Forge Rolled is that resin is a bad material for making big minis, and all over the model there were little wrinkles, bubbles, mold slippages, and imperfections that had to go. Another thing that really shouldn't be resin are all of these microscopic teeth. Each boat has 40 of these little tiny spikes, and they all need to be placed by hand in the correct orientation. I quickly ran out of these spikes, but luckily this is a part that also exists on the plastic boats. I went through all the sprues of my Raiders and Ravagers, stealing all of these bits, and this gave me enough to fill up both boats. These spikes are also annoying on the plastic kits, but at least they can be assembled with plastic glue. I have to super glue these onto the resin and hope for the best. 40 individual little tiny teeth that all need to be glued on one by one into the little holes that don't quite fit. If this wasn't one of the most beautiful kits Games Workshop has ever made, I would want to give up. Forge World is an absolute project in looking over the model, scanning every single millimeter of it, and trying to beautify it. With a plastic kit, basically it looks perfect as soon as you're done following the instructions, but with a Forge World model, you gotta put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. And then when you're finally done, you don't even get to play with it. I mean, I'm gonna get to play with mine, but only in non-competitive events, friendly pickup games, and the occasional apocalypse game. Games Workshop. It doesn't even make sense. Just a random day in February, no more Tantalus. Not so much as an announcement. It would be one thing if they were like moving from 10th edition to 11th edition and everything is up in the air. You don't know what's gonna be in your list moving forward. You don't know what the stat lines of your units are gonna be. And then they decide, you know what, we're not gonna sell the Tantalus anymore. That's kind of fair. But just a random day in February with no Dark Eldar Codex even on the horizon, and they're just like, no more Tantalus. It's a little feels bad. But you know what else feels bad? Some of these pieces that came with these Forge World kits. Look at this bit. This is the boom vang or the kicking strap, the thing that the boom rides along to steer the ship, and it's all kinds of warped with tons of resin flash. The trouble is that with resin, you only get so many pulls from a silicone mold, and the smaller the bit is, the more damage the mold gets, so if my Tantalus was number 10 or more pulled from the mold, the parts are just gonna be bad. I sanded and reshaped the bit, filing it down and fixing it as best I could, and then these little bits needed to get reshaped. After a short soak in hot water, I can bend them back to mostly correct. The control panel pegs into the rudder, which probably worked okay on the master model, but on mine, I had to re-drill this slot. And look at the laughable idea they had on how the large heavy sail sticks on. A peg goes up from underneath and then slides through the wing into the sail. This doesn't work, even a little, so I have to rebuild this. I took the biggest piece of brass rod I could fit and then drilled a hole to match. Then I did the same thing on the sail, cutting as much of the hole out as I could. The longer the brass, the more stable it'll be. To cut the brass, I used a grinding wheel on my Dremel tool. Now with some metal holding the sail in place, it actually sits. You could say these boats are ready to set sail. Forge World resin is a beast and a half, but I now have 2 space yachts. Oh, this is exciting. I really want to bring some Tantaluses in-game. Forge World minis, typically, they have really unique skewing bad data sheets, but the Tantaluses are actually surprisingly usable, which just makes the fact that they were squatted hurt even harder, but the Tantaluses are interesting. Tantali are rules-wise 2 raiders taped together, but their points costed like Space Marine Land Raiders, and they're the size of Imperial Guard Baneblades. They are wacky, but their rules would take a lot of people by surprise. Movement 16, transport capacity 16, firing deck 16, toughness 10, 4-up save, 5-up invulnerable save, 18 wounds. These party buses are surprisingly tanky for Dark Eldar. In terms of armament, these guys have the Pulse Disintegrators. Kind of annoyingly, there's physically 2 Pulse Disintegrators on each boat, but they don't have twin linked. Feels a little bit like an oversight, but it's an oversight that'll never get corrected because once again, these guys have been moved to Legends and their rules will never get updated, but kind of a fun gun. 12 shots of strength 10, AP-2, damage 2. That can kill some Space Marines. And Dark Eldar have access to really easy reroll hits, so that is 12 shots rerolling most of the time. In Sky Splinter Assault, there's an enhancement so that when my guys hop out of a boat, if I give a pain token to them, then the boat also becomes empowered. So that is 2 pain tokens for the price of 1. Looking at the close combat aspect of these boats, you wouldn't think you'd want to look at the close combat aspect because they're transports, but they're actually kind of good. 6 attacks of strength 8, only hitting on 4s, but once again, rerolls are easy with Dark Eldar. And their special ability, Scything Blades, these guys do mortal wounds on the charge. You want to charge Tantaluses into close combat to deal on average 4 mortal wounds. And they're tanks, so they can tank shock. And their toughness 10, so they're gonna do an average of like 5 or 6 more mortal wounds on top of those 4. These guys are kinda wild. Dark Eldar don't have a lot of mortal wound shenanigans, but I'm looking at 2 of the best ways to do some weird mortal wound stuff. I am really excited to take the Tantaluses for a spin in friendly games of Warhammer 40,000 because once again, Games Workshop hates me and they've sent these guys to Legends so they can no longer be brought in competitive games of Warhammer 40,000, but I'm okay. I'm not mad. I'm definitely not mad. And the next step of these Tantaluses is gonna be getting these guys on some bases. And that is another big problem with Forge World. Games Workshop didn't make a way for these things to actually exist. They don't come with a base, they don't come with any way to actually keep them up in the air, and these models can't support their own weight. Right now I have them on soda cans because that's the only way I can precariously have all of their points facing down. I gotta make some bases for these guys, and I've made that particularly hard on myself because I resin cast all of my Dark Eldar bases, and these guys are gonna need some really big bases. Luckily, I bought some new silicone. I carefully moved my Tantaluses out of the danger zone and then cleaned my desk. To build my Dark Eldar bases, I set them in a spiky world. I don't know if this is a death world or just one of the nicer locations in Kamara, but it requires scratch building this location. For this project, I bought a baggie of large slate rocks, and to get them attached to a footing the size of a Games Workshop flying stand, I used wads of paper towel, pouring ultra-thin superglue over this to instantly turn them into a hard resin. And a word of caution, this creates tons of cyanoacrylite fumes. Ventilation and face protection is a must. I built up the rocks, making the front of each base a bouquet of jagged angry rocks, and then I filled up in between these large stones with a bunch of smaller pieces of slate. With my rocks in place, I used the back of my brush to crush wads of paper towel in between the rocks and then locking them down with more ultra-thin superglue. Then I mixed up some milliput and skinned the paper towel, using some sculpting tools and chunks of cork to recreate the slate texture. Now I have a humongous chunk of rock putty and resin. The finishing touch is sprinkling on some pulverized slate rock, sprinkling this onto the base. Letting the sand fall naturally over the base gives some realism, and I locked it all down with more ultra-thin superglue. Now honestly, these custom bases are kinda nasty. They're big, heavy, will probably warp and crack over time. The superglue paper towel is a ticking time bomb, but honestly, it doesn't matter. I only need them to be nice today. This is by far the biggest base I have made for my Dark Eldar army, and as it is made out of rocks, it weighs a little more than a pound. Cast out of resin, it'll probably weigh about half of this, but even that might be a little bit too heavy. I'm gonna have to get really creative with the casting. I traced my bases onto some foam core board, and I grabbed a straight edge to find all the overhangs so I could transfer these to the ground. I joined the stick out to the rest of the oval and then made marks 1/4 inch away from the edge and then traced this new line. This weird shape kinda looks like an avocado. I drew on a pit to complete the look. Then I cut it out, skinning the paper surface with tape to make a plastic barrier that the silicone won't get through. And now I need some mold walls. I grabbed some cardboard and cut it into strips tall enough that it was twice as high as the highest part of the base. Then I hot glued them on. Hot glue is important for this because it makes a rubber barrier to keep the mold watertight. Now I need to know how much silicone I need. I poured sand into the mold until the rocks were completely covered. Then I transferred this amount of sand into a plastic cup, making a mark and then filling the cup with water up to the mark. Then I weighed it, and this tells me exactly how much silicone I need to make. 13.7 ounces, so I need 6.8 ounces of A and B of the smooth-on silicone. I opened up my fresh silicone and gave them a stir. Silicone doesn't have a long shelf life, so if you buy some, check immediately after you buy to see if it's still usable, and then use it up quickly. I prepared 2 batches of about 7 ounces each, and this silicone is Smooth-On Mold Star 16 Fast. It has a 6-minute working time and a 30-minute cure time. And I've used up enough of this product to know that those times are exact. I used a homemade stir stick and my drill to stir up the silicone, working as fast as I could. And I ran into a problem. My measurements were exact, but the sticky thick silicone kept sticking to my tools and cups and probably kept a ½ ounce out of my mold, and the pointiest rock just barely was sticking out the top. This will become the bottom of my mold, so I can't have that. I grabbed my old silicone molds and cut out chunks of silicone and dropped them into the mold to get the level to rise. This worked, and as added protection, when I poured my second mold, I made just a little extra and poured this on top onto the danger spot. After 30 minutes, the silicone was cured and ready to rock. I tore away my mold jacket and slowly peeled the silicone off my master model. This left me with a perfect impression of my bases, and now I can cast them. For resin, I use Illuminate Amazing Casting Resin White. This stuff has a 2-minute working time and a 10-minute cure time. It's fast, and I mixed a few drops of Illuminate black dye because I want my bases to be black. I mixed up the 2 halves and then poured them into the molds, using a disposable paintbrush to work the resin into all the surfaces. Then I kept tilting the bases so the resin flowed all around, making a skin of resin, and since it has a 10-minute cure time, as I was tilting the base, the resin set up. I did 2 more layers of resin on each mold, doing the same tilting to build up the wall thickness of these bases. Making the bases hollow like this will let me use a much smaller amount of resin. If I did 1 solid pour, it would probably use up the entire bottle. And this is fast curing resin, and that much resin might get so hot it could damage the silicone mold or start to boil. And you know what else can get dangerously hot? That's right, EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch like the Nick and Jay dice, and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain pack or any previous pack we have ever made. For the month of March, we are completing our The Fall Battlefield series with Battlefield Support. A set of terrain focused around filling in a war zone with all the infrastructure necessary for a proper battlefield. This set includes gothically bedazzled tank traps for protection, modular bridges for creating hills and ramps, blown out shell craters for infantry to take cover in, armored carrier buses for transporting weapons and ammunition to and from the front lines, and pallets for all the supplies a growing campaign needs. This pack perfectly complements the fall buildings and the fall guns and is the perfect way to add those finishing touches to make a battlefield look real. After 10 minutes, my bases were ready to get pulled from the mold, and it was time to see if this was worth it. Success! They look great! Oh, I'm so glad. There are a few imperfections, a number of bubbles formed here and there. I poured the silicone on the mold too fast, but it's no big deal. I just looked around for these bubbles and cut them off where I found them. And a lot of them are so small, they'll just blend into the sand. Next, I gave the bottoms of my castings a sand, first with 100 grit sandpaper, then 220 to make them nice and flat. Then I took my peel and stick magnet bottoms and stuck them down. Now I have my bases, and this was a lot of work, but I will get more than just Tantalus bases out of them. They are the perfect size if I ever want to build some Razor Wing jet fighters or Void Raven bombers for my army. To get my Tantali to stand, they need a flight stand, and I don't want to mess around. I'm thinking thick metal is what I want holding up my boats. I took big pieces of brass rod and drilled holes into the base and inserted these with epoxy resin. Then I carefully drilled a matching hole onto the bottom of my Tantaluses, and finally, my boats can stand on their own. No soda cans needed. The last step is attaching all these little things that look like something Blade would throw at a vampire. Just from sitting on my desk, the points of these knives have gotten a little warpy. I used some more hot water to fix up these tips, and if they ever warp again, they might just have to live that way. Now, Games Workshop sculpted these with tiny little resin pegs that fit into holes underneath the Tantalus. This is adorable and absolutely not gonna work. Instead, I cut off these pegs and inserted quite a bit of 1mm brass rod. This will do two things for me. It'll actually hold them onto the resin, and I can bend them. I want to pose these blades how I want, and I want them sticking out on an angle. These blades do mortal wounds, so I want them to look like they could reach out and slice up Sean's Imperial Guard. After days and days and days and days of sanding, unwarping bent parts, sanding, applying 80 tiny little individual spikes, sanding, using every glue under the sun to try to get resin to stick together, sanding, inventing bases out of nowhere, and even more sanding, I have two, count them, two, beautiful Tantaluses. Games Workshop might have removed them from the game, but I have the datasheet screenshotted, so I'm kinda gonna be okay. I've got the rules saved in my computer, so I am ready to go to bring these in as many games as I possibly can in 10th edition. And honestly, 11th edition is probably gonna be a 10.5 edition, so I'm gonna get to bring these Tantaluses to a lot of games. Honestly, a bigger issue with these models is gonna be, how do I own them? Like, how am I gonna get these to the friendly local game store? Where am I gonna put them in my house? These things are a foot long and almost a foot tall. They're hard to own. And speaking of owning these things, I've just got them built. Painting is gonna be its own challenge. I think a much smaller challenge than getting them built, but they are very big and very pointy, and I'm very nervous about knocking off all of these little teeth, but I am up for the challenge. The reason I'm putting together a Dark Eldar army is because I am battling Scott the Miniature Maniac's Dark Eldar army come this Adepticon. And in March, Scott is gonna get double tantalized.